Welcome to the video tutorial on molecular shape and application of VESPR, the valence shell electron pair repulsion theory. Alrighty, so let's make sure that we're all clear on what we mean. Right, so the shape of the molecules is the three-dimensional arrangement. Let's see, arrangement, right, of the atoms. Alright, so that's the molecular shape. So the molecular shape is going to depend on the electron geometry. So we will build up to that, but why do we even care about this? Well, it's very important. The shapes of our molecules and their charge distribution is a way that our cells can communicate with each other. A couple examples is hormones at receptor sites on the surface of cells, and drug molecules interacting with other molecules within the cell. So it's very important that we can visualize these three-dimensional shapes. So you can think of this as brain yoga. So we will begin with the electron geometry. This will be the arrangement of the electrons around the central atom. So this is going to make use of our Lewis structures. Right? So the Lewis structures are how we're going to figure out the electron geometry. Once we know the electron geometry, then we can make predictions about the molecular shape, which will be the arrangement of the atoms around the central atom. So there's really only one rule here. Electrons want to stay as far apart as possible because like charges repel. So when we're looking at the central atom of a Lewis structure, we can predict the electron geometry. If there are four groups of electrons around the central atom, we describe that as a tetrahedral electron geometry. Now this is the only one that's truly three-dimensional. So to draw this three-dimensional shape, we will have our central atom, which will usually be carbon, and we can draw two atoms in the plane, and then one atom is going to poke out of the paper as a wedge. So this pokes out, and then we'll have a dashed line representing poking in. Pokes in. All right, so let me grab a model, and so that I can show you this tetrahedral geometry. So here is the tetrahedral shape, and we can see that no matter how we spin the molecule, all of these electron groups, these single bonds, are radiating out into the corner of the tetrahedron. So the way I've drawn it on the paper, we've put these three atoms in the plane. And so the atoms in the plane get the straight line. Now, this atom that's poking out towards you, it got the wedge, and then this atom here, this bond, got the dashed line, showing that it's going back into the paper. So if I slide the paper over, right, we can see the wedge poking out, and now the dash is hidden because it's behind the plane of the paper. Alrighty, so now we'll go back to our notes. Alrighty, the other two electron geometries, all the atoms rest in the same plane. So we could have trigonal planar and linear. Now associated with these electron geometries are the bond angles. So with the tetrahedral, the bond angle between each and every one of these atoms, they're all about 109 degrees. With the trigonal planar, they're all 120. And for linear, it's 180. All right? So from the Lewis structure, we determine how many groups of electrons are around the central atom, and that tells us our electron geometry. There are only three possible electron geometries: tetrahedral, trigonal planar, and linear. And they have these corresponding bond angles. So now let's explore this with actual molecules and then connect the electron geometry to the molecular shape. So we'll look on our next handout. And we'll start with the simplest and we'll work our way up to the more complex. All right, so remember that the electron geometry is going to come from the Lewis structure. All righty, so first we'll look at when we have a linear electron geometry. Now this can occur in two different ways. We can have two double bonds around the central atom. So that could be like carbon dioxide. And so this can be an interesting thing when we're first working with this theory, is that this is a double bond. It's considered one group of electrons. So we have two groups of electrons, and they are going to orient themselves to be as far apart as possible. So we get our 180-degree bond angles. Now, when we're talking about the electron geometry, we're looking at the electrons. When we're talking about molecular shape, now we're only looking at atoms, atoms only. So if we look at the atoms, the carbon and the two oxygens, we see that they're all forming a line. So the molecular shape is the same, linear, as the electron geometry. That's what makes this one the simplest. Here's another example. What if we had we could have a triple bond and a single bond. So here's an example. It's a little bit larger molecule. We actually have two central atoms. So if we focus on the carbon on the left, right? We looked at the carbon on the left, we would see that there's a single bond and a triple bond. So this hydrogen and the two carbons are all going to be in a straight line. So we would describe that as the molecular shape as linear. So notice that a group of electrons can be a single bond, a double bond, or a triple bond. And that the bond angle here will be the 180 degrees. So let me show you a model of this arrangement. So here's a model of the last molecule we worked with. The black signify the carbons, the whites the hydrogen. So if we focus here, if the atom, this carbon atom, if we consider it the central atom, we see that there's two groups of electrons, a single bond and a triple bond. If you want, we can simply ignore this hydrogen for a minute. So the central atom that I'm holding here, this carbon, we would describe it as having a linear electron geometry because there are two groups of electrons, a single bond and a triple bond, and we would describe it as having a linear molecular shape because notice that all of the atoms are in a straight line. All right, now we'll move to the next electron geometry, the trigonal planar. So here we have three groups of electrons around the central atom. So for example, if we could have one double bond and two single bonds. So for example, if we have carbon with a double bond to sulfur and then a hydrogen and a hydrogen, if we look at this carbon, it has three groups of electrons, two single bonds and a double bond. So these bond angles will all be 120 degrees. Another example that to match our models, I'll do over here, we'll do a slightly larger molecule we'll look at when we have two carbon atoms, right? So if we focus on the carbon atom on the left as our central atom, that means we're focusing our attention right here. So we would see that this central atom is surrounded by 3 groups of electrons, 2 single bonds and a double bond. So we would describe the electron geometry around this carbon, or this carbon as being trigonal planar. And these bond angles will all be approximately 120 degrees. So the molecular shape matches the electron geometry. So the molecular shape would also be described as trigonal planar. However, now there is the possibility of having lone pairs. So a non-bonding pair is also called a lone pair. So when we have a lone pair around the central atom, this is how we get a difference between the electron geometry and the molecular geometry. So let me draw an example here. So for example, if we had sulfur dioxide, all right, so if we look at our central atom, lone pairs are also considered a group of electrons. So we have lone pairs, that's the first group, a single bond, that's the second group, and the double bond is the third group. So these two central atoms share the same electron geometry. We describe it as trigonal planar. However, when we go to the molecular shape, then remember that it's atoms only. So when we look at these atoms, they form a bent or angular arrangement. So now let me show you some models to illustrate the trigonal planar electron geometry and molecular shape. So here's our first example. Here's the 2 carbons with the 4 hydrogens. So if we want, we'll just disregard. So here's our central atom. So we can see that it has 2 single bonds and a double bond. That creates the 3 groups of electrons. So we describe the electron geometry around this central atom as trigonal planar. Notice that all of the atoms are lying in the same plane. And this molecule has symmetry. So notice that that all 6 atoms are all lying in the same plane. So each one of these carbon atoms would be described as having trigonal planar electron geometry and the molecular shape, right? The atoms are radiating out into the corners of the triangle, and we'll have the 120-degree bond angles. Now, where the difference occurs is this would be the sulfur. Yellow's the sulfur, and the reds are the oxygens. So now here, the lone pair will symbolize it's in an orbital. So there's the lone pair, the 2 non-bonding electrons. So if we compare these central atoms, we can see that each central atom has the same electron geometry. There are 3 groups of electrons. So here we have the lone pair, the single bond, and the double bond. These electrons want to be as far apart from each other as possible. This electron geometry would also be called trigonal planar. However, when we go to the molecular shape, now we ignore the lone pair, and so when we look at this shape, we see that the 3 atoms are not in a straight line. So we would describe the molecular shape around this central atom as bent. So if we compare that to our linear, we can see the difference between all of the atoms being in a straight line versus bent. So the similarity here, though, is same electron geometry, different molecular shape. What these two have in common, they're both trigonal planar electron geometries. And now we'll look at the last geometry we'll focus on for this course. We will look at the tetrahedron or tetrahedral electron geometry. Now we have 4 groups of electrons. So we've looked at this, this shape already, but we'll review it. So carbon, when carbon has 4 single bonds, they're going to radiate out into the corners of the tetrahedron. Notice that every time there's no lone pairs, right? When the central atom has no lone pairs, the molecular shape and the electron geometry are the same. So here we have 4 groups of electrons, 4 single bonds. That creates the tetrahedral electron geometry with the 109-degree bond angles. And because our central atom has no lone pairs, the molecular shape is the same as the electron geometry. However, it's possible to have the non-bonding lone pairs. So, for example, if we look at ammonia, so then we would have the 3 hydrogens coming off of the nitrogen, and they're going to go into the corners of the tetrahedron, and then we have the lone pair. So remember, those lone pair electrons are whirling about, creating a force field of negative charge. So here we still, these 2 molecules, what do they have that's the same? They both have the same electron geometry, whether it's 4 single bonds or 3 single bonds and a lone pair. That creates the 4 groups of electrons. And now the last variation of our tetrahedral electron geometry would be when we have 2 lone pairs, 2 non-bonding pairs. And this is what we see with water. Water has, the oxygen on water has the 2 single bonds to the hydrogen and then the 2 lone pairs. So once again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 groups of electrons. Electrons find each other repulsive, so they're going to move as far apart as possible. And when there's 4 groups of electrons, the tetrahedral electron geometry is as far apart as they can get. As soon as we have lone pairs present, then we get the variation. Notice that ammonia, if we're focusing on the atoms only, has a different shape from the methane. Here it's called, it's trigonal because there's only 3 hydrogens surrounding, or 3 atoms surrounding the central atom, so we have trigonal. But in this example, the nitrogen is not in the same plane as the hydrogen, so it's created the pyramid. And with water, this is another example of the bent or angular. The difference here, though, is because we have the tetrahedral electron geometry, this is going to be about 109 degrees. Versus our example up here, right, this had the trigonal planar geometry, so this bent molecule has a different bond angle than this bent molecule because of the differences in the electron geometry. So here we're back to the names of bent or angular. So now that we've described it for you in pictures, let's take a look at the models. So here is our tetrahedral electron geometry and molecular shape, since there are no lone pairs around the central atom. And it's helpful when looking at this shape, right, to think about putting as many atoms as possible into the plane of the page. So then we see one poking out and one coming back. Now, this is our ammonia example. So the blue is the nitrogen and the whites are the hydrogens, but we have to remember there's the lone pair. So those two non-bonding electrons create a force field of repulsion that bends down these single bonds. It's important that you can distinguish between the two types of trigonals. So if we look here, I'll take these hydrogens off to try to minimize the confusion. Here we have two central atoms. They both can be described as trigonal, but trigonal is not enough information to describe them completely. Notice with this model here, the trigonal planar, how all of the atoms, all four atoms are in the same plane. Trigonal planar. Versus the ammonia or the nitrogen, trigonal pyramidal. See how the central atom is raised above the four hydrogen atoms. So they're both trigonal. Both of them have the central atom surrounded by three other atoms, but we would describe this as trigonal planar and trigonal pyramidal. And then the last option is our water molecule. The oxygen is red, the hydrogens are white. We have the two single bonds, and then we would have the lone pairs. So notice if we focus on the electrons, right? Tetrahedral, tetrahedral, and tetrahedral. What do these all three molecules have in common? They are all tetrahedral electron geometry. When there are no lone pairs around the central atom, the molecular shape is the same. When we have one lone pair, the molecular shape becomes trigonal pyramidal. And when we have two lone pairs, the molecular shape becomes bent. So we see that they're not in a line. Alrighty. Okay, so there we'll go back to the notes and we'll tie this all together with some follow-up questions. Okay, so the overall strategy, right, is that the electron geometry is going to determine the molecular shape, right? So the first thing we have to do is draw the Lewis structure, right? This is how we know, right, the number of electron groups, right? And then it's important to recognize that electron groups can be lone pairs, right? Single bonds, double bonds, or triple bonds. All right, so we're only going to focus on 3 electron geometries: tetrahedral, trigonal planar, and linear. When we want to look for the molecular shape, remember now we're looking for atoms only. So we ignore the lone pairs. And so we can get a difference between the molecular shape and the electron geometry when there are lone pairs present. Okay? So the lone pairs, they create the difference between the molecular shape and the electron geometry. All right? So now let's practice this a bit and tie it all together. So so the first thing we have to do is we have to have the Lewis structure. We have to know how many groups of electrons we have. Alrighty. So when we look here, phosphorus is our central atom, and it's going to be surrounded by the 3 hydrogens. And then we have to know how many valence electrons we have. So for phosphorus, it brings in 5. The hydrogens, 3 times 1. So we have 8 valence electrons. The first 6 go into connecting our atoms. We've got 1 pair left, which works out perfect because phosphorus wants an octet. So if we look at phosphorus, the electron geometry, 1, 2, 3, 4 groups. We would describe this as a tetrahedral electron geometry. However, for the molecular shape, we have a lone pair. With 1 lone pair present, the molecular shape is going to be trigonal pyramidal. And remember that the bond angles are determined from the electron geometry, so they would be about 109 degrees. All right, let's work one more practice problem before you get started on your homework. CH2O, right? So the carbon is the central atom, and then the hydrogens and the oxygen surround the carbon. How many valence electrons do we have? The carbon gives us 4. The hydrogens, so there's 2. They each give us 1. And the oxygen gives us 6. So altogether we have 12 electrons. The first thing we do is we use 6 electrons to connect all of the atoms. Now we have 6 electrons left. Using our understanding of bonding patterns, and if drawing these Lewis structures you're finding confusing, there is a video tutorial that does focus specifically on drawing the Lewis structures. So if you need more practice with drawing Lewis structures, please take advantage of that resource. We have 6 electrons here that are left over. So we know carbon has to have 4 bonds and oxygen wants 2 bonds. Well, we're going to need to bring in that 4th bond for carbon and that 2nd bond for oxygen. So that leaves us then with 4 electrons, and then taking advantage of our organic compound bonding patterns, we know oxygen wants 2 bonds and 2 lone pairs. So now we have used up all 12 of our valence electrons, and we've created an octet for carbon, 2, 4, 6, 8, and an octet for oxygen, 2, 4, 6, 8. And of course hydrogen just wants the duet. So now if we look at carbon as the central atom, we see 1, 2, 3 groups of electrons, 2 single bonds and a double bond. That will make our electron geometry trigonal planar. Now there are lone pairs in this compound, but they are not on the central atom. Anytime the central atom has all bonds and no lone pairs, we know that the molecular shape is identical to the electron geometry. And the bond angles for trigonal planar are about 120 degrees. So here are so that concludes the overview of determining electron geometry and molecular shape from Lewis structures. Please take some time now to reinforce your understanding with some practice problems.